last couple of units, we've done a lot of discussion that sort of suggests that there's something wrong with the way that the federal government relates to Canada's Indigenous people and vice versa, and that there's some stuff that not everyone's particularly happy with. What I want to talk about today is to sort of clarify that everybody knows that there's a problem. In that, yes, there's a lot of Indigenous groups who aren't happy, but the federal government isn't really happy with it either. We could have some very long conversations about whether or not it is appropriate for the federal government to be upset about that, because their discomfort and dislike of that relationship is generally linked to it's too expensive to pay for people living on reserve, and it's an amount of money we'd rather spend elsewhere, which is sort of a challenging position if you sort of take the approach to Canada that we are all treaty people and sort of to treat those treaties like formal obligations. However, the federal government is pretty aware that there's something wrong, and we get some proposals about this from sort of relatively early on, from a cast of characters, notably that we have probably already seen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1969 White Paper. This is something that was put together as a proposal from Pierre Trudeau when he was minister responsible for it. And just sort of to put this in context, White Paper is the name of the cover for the Queen's printer. So when this kind of policy document goes out, there's like an order, like a rotation for the cover color. So it might be a white paper, it might be a blue paper, it might be a green paper, it might be a red paper, that kind of thing. It's not called white paper because it's simulationist, although it is also a simulationist. There's some unfortunate timing in that sort of space. But this is a document that Pierre Trudeau put together, and if you really think through his understanding in terms of what he did with the Constitution, you can really see sort of a through line of the same kind of ideas, right? When we talked about Pierre Trudeau's federalism, one of the things that I said was that from Pierre Trudeau's perspective, the problem in Canada was that there were too many groups of people who thought they were too different from anyone else, right? So when he did things like change the Constitution, he removed Quebec's perceived traditional veto power intentionally, and he removed it because from his perspective, it didn't make sense to have a group of Canadians who had rights that other Canadians didn't have, okay? So with that in mind, and understanding that that is the philosophical position that Pierre Trudeau is coming from, the proposals in this white paper will probably make a little bit more sense. In the sense that these proposals essentially say, okay, we're going to disband DIAN, so the Department of Indian and Northern Affairs and Northern Development, as it was then called. It has a slightly different name now. Repealed the Indian Act and transferred responsibility for service provision, i.e. health, education, all of those sorts of things, to the provinces, which is essentially to say that this proposal was to eliminate the idea of status Indigenous people in this country, because all of those statuses are regulated by the Indian Act, and they're administered by DIAN, and there's sort of the distinction is between the provision of services at the provincial level versus the federal level. And for Trudeau, that's a win. That's a really great idea, because that means that you have no Canadians who are unlike any others, and for example, all of the students who are living in Alberta get education delivered through the same system, so it's going to be comparable in quality, comparable in terms of healthcare. That was the goal. And you can agree with Trudeau or disagree with Trudeau. What I want you to understand is that from his perspective, what he's trying to do is fix a problem. He's trying to fix a problem that he perceives about there being two classes of Canadians, right? And he's trying to do that by making everything the same for everyone. And he thinks he's making it better. Okay? You don't have to agree with him. There's a lot of people who don't. Notably, pretty much every Indigenous leader in the country. And their sort of pushback is generally linked to sort of two things. The first is that in eliminating all of those structures, one of the things that winds up happening is pushing Indigenous people to assimilate. So it becomes an assimilationist policy, right? Because there's no more, for example, Indigenous education, because instead all you have is Alberta education. And if you can't convince the Alberta government to include Indigenous content in their curriculum, then your students don't get it. Not that they were getting a whole lot of it before under the federal government, but this is sort of part of that conversation. The other sort of piece is that Indigenous leaders are sort of really upset about by this proposal is that it is perceived as really paternalistic, in that Trudeau didn't ask the Indigenous populations of Canada if this is what they wanted. And don't get me wrong, there are a lot of Indigenous people across this country who have very strong, very negative feelings about the Indian Act. This is the legal document, this is the legal framework for reserves, for residential schools, for all kinds of things that are really, 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 really bad. But that doesn't mean that Indigenous populations and Indigenous leadership and Indigenous people want a whole-scale repeal of that act, because that act is also the one that sort of talks about treaty rights, and it's also the one that sort of talks about federal responsibilities to fund healthcare and education and all of those sorts of pieces that are integral in terms of making Indigenous communities work. So while there are many, many, many Indigenous leaders in Canada who want significant changes to the Indian Act, that doesn't mean they want to throw it out entirely. And there's also sort of a conversation in there about wanting to, about the sort of desire in what Trudeau's proposing here to essentially remove the idea of an individual who is wholly responsible for Indigenous issues and Indigenous relationships, right? Because if you don't have a Department of Indian Affairs and Northern Development, as I said, as it was called in the late 60s, then you don't have a Minister of Indian Affairs, which means that there's no one in cabinet whose only job is to deal with Indigenous issues in Canada. So there's that kind of problem. That's one of the outcomes, is basically that Indigenous leaders are really, really angry about it. But there are some more, I guess, positive pieces that come out of that. So one of the things that came out of the sort of outrage around the 1969 white paper was a notion that sort of governs how we understand Indigenous rights and the like in Canada now. And that's this idea of Citizens Plus. So in some ways this is embracing Trudeau's idea that everyone should have the same rights. And so this is an idea to say that there are some rights that accrue to Canadians as citizens, okay? And then there's an additional set of rights that accrue to Indigenous Canadians by virtue of their being Indigenous. So every Canadian citizen has the rights of citizens, okay? And then Indigenous Canadians get all the rights of citizenship, plus additional rights that accrue to them through their Indigenous status. That includes things like treaty payments, that includes sort of rights to language preservation, that kind of thing, in a more contemporary context. So that notion of Citizens Plus sort of comes out of the strong opposition to the 1969 white paper. And it also sort of highlighted a need for two different kinds of claims to be made against the Indian Claims Commissioner. And I don't think many of you have ever had to deal with the Indian Claims Commissioner, but they are the person, I suppose the office. There's a person whose job title is the Indian Claims Commissioner, but it's really an office full of people who do this work. But if you need to go see the Indian Claims Commissioner, you are making one of two different kinds of claims. And this is sort of a split that happened after the 1969 white paper to sort of develop those two possibilities. So the first kind of claim is probably the simplest, which is what they call a specific claim. And a specific claim is the kind of claim you make when you are an Indigenous group or person who is covered under treaty and finds that their treaty obligations, like that the benefits they are supposed to be receiving by treaty are not being met. So if, for example, you have treaty rights to education and the federal government has refused to build a school on or near accessible to sort of your home community, you can go to the Indian Claims Commissioner and complain and basically say, hey, I'm owed a school near my community, you need to fix that. and that like this is inappropriate, you need to build one, you need to make that accessible to me. This is, by the way, this kind of claim specifically around schooling is still happening. There are lots and lots and lots of remote communities in this country where Indigenous young people are being told that if they want to finish high school, they have to get on a plane, go a couple hundred kilometers away from their families, live on their own in order to be able to finish high school, because there isn't um, enough space, there isn't they haven't made accommodations to allow those students to continue their educations in their home community. So that kind of specific claim is still important, it's still real. But that's only sort of one kind of claim that is now possible under the Indian Claims Commissioner. And the second kind of claim is, this is sort of a shift in the late 60s, if you remember, when we talked about this way back in September, the conversation around how for a long time it was against the law for Indigenous groups to raise money to sue the government or to set money aside to sue the government and sort of argue around land claims and to make claims for treaty. That one of the fallouts of the sort of 69 white paper is the development of what they refer to as a comprehensive claims process. This is a claim that is also made to the Indian Claims Commissioner. However, it's a very different kind of claim. So instead of claiming that this is sort of, we have these treaty rights and the government is not respecting their obligations, a comprehensive claim is what happens when an Indigenous group is essentially saying to the federal government, we don't have a treaty and we should. Okay, so this could be a couple of different things. We'll talk about some examples later on in this unit, but this could be a couple of things. This could be, there were for a long time large portions of the sort of northern part of Canada that were never covered under treaty because there wasn't a ton of interest in settling that land. So there was no treaties, for example, for what is now Nunavut until like a process that started in the 1970s. We'll talk about that next week. But it's also the kind of thing about, we'll talk about sort of the process. And we talked a little bit about the process for negotiating these treaties, but it might be, for example, to say, oh, we are a band who lives on the territory in Treaty 6, but you never invited us or any of our ancestors to those treaty meetings, so you don't have access to our land. You might have access to our neighbor's land, and our land might overlap with that, but they can't give away our claim to it. So comprehensive claims are essentially claims that insist on new treaties. And we'll sort of get into this a little bit later on as we talk about sort of contemporary treaties that have been negotiated in more, I guess, of the present day. But it is really important to understand that as far as comprehensive claims go, it is up to the Indian Claims Commissioner to decide if they want to hear them, which basically means the federal government gets to decide whether or not they wish to negotiate new treaties. So that is kind of that, some roughed in background for this. We're going to talk a little bit about more specific issues in Indigenous communities and challenges in that sort of space. So